Catherine, your contribution is appreciated. The promotion isn't aligned with our current structure. It was 10:47 in the morning when she said it. I remember the time because I caught myself staring at the small silver clock on the wall behind her, the kind every HR office seems to have, ticking quietly through conversations that change people's lives. For years, that's how long I had been hearing some version of that sentence. Different words each time, same outcome. We were sitting in a corner office on the 22nd floor, the kind of room designed to make difficult conversations feel less difficult. Soft lighting, beige walls, a window that opened up to the city skyline like it was meant to remind you that there were bigger things outside this room. Across from me sat Diane from HR, perfectly composed, hands folded on top of a slim folder. To her right, my director, Mark Whitfield. Mid-50s, tailored navy suit, the kind of executive who builds his reputation on polished delivery rather than results that anyone can actually trace. He didn't look at me when she said it. He looked at the folder. That part registered before the words did. The promotion isn't aligned. I had heard that phrase or variations of it for 4 years now. Aligned. As if my role were a piece of furniture that needed to be moved into the right corner. As if the accounts I had built from scratch, the relationships I had nurtured for over a decade, the revenue numbers I had pulled out of dead pipelines, were all somehow not aligned with whatever invisible structure they kept referencing. Diane slid a single sheet across the table, same title as last review, same band, same salary range, just a confirmation neatly printed of everything that wasn't changing. "We've reviewed your performance carefully," she said, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "And while your results are strong, the leadership track has specific criteria that aren't quite met yet. Aren't quite met." I almost let out a small breath of something that wasn't quite a laugh. That's the part most people don't understand. When you sit across from someone delivering bad news in a calm tone, there's a strange moment where your mind tries to accept it, because the room is calm. The words are calm. The decision was made somewhere upstairs long before you ever walked through that door, and now they're just reading it back to you, smooth, professional, irreversible. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not defensively, just steady. "I closed the territory expansion last quarter," I said. "The Atlantic accounts, the Henderson contract, the Midwest restructure." Mark finally spoke. "And we recognize that, Catherine, we really do," still not looking at me. "But promotion isn't only about numbers," he added. "It's about leadership presence." Leadership presence, another phrase, another version of the same wall. Over 4 years I had heard every word they had in their vocabulary: visibility, readiness, alignment, optics. The words changed, the answer didn't. I didn't argue. I just let the words settle into the air between us, the way you do when you finally accept that the conversation in front of you was never going to end any other way. "My name is Catherine Hale. I'm 44 years old." At that moment, I had spent 11 years inside that company, senior account executive, the one clients asked for by name, the one whose phone rang first when a deal was about to fall apart or a renewal was wobbling. I had carried the largest book of business in our division for 3 consecutive years, and somehow the leadership track was still aligned somewhere just beyond my reach. Diane closed the folder. "We can revisit this at the next cycle." Next cycle, I almost smiled. Mark adjusted his cuff the way he always did when a meeting was about to end. "We want you to stay engaged, Catherine. You're a key part of this team. Key part, not essential, not irreplaceable. Just key in the way a single piece of a much larger puzzle is key." I nodded once, slowly. "Understood," I said, no emotion, no pushback. Because there's a point in these conversations where you realize you're not negotiating a promotion anymore. You're observing how a company sees you. And once you see that clearly, no amount of arguing changes it. I stood up, smoothed the front of my blazer, and thanked them for their time. Polite. Measured. Exactly the way they expected someone like me to respond. Because that's part of the role too. Not just hitting numbers, not just closing deals. Managing the perception of how you receive disappointment. As I walked out of the office, I caught my reflection in the glass wall by the elevator. Same composure, same calm expression. You wouldn't have known a single thing had shifted, but it had. Because that meeting wasn't a denial of a title. It was a decision about value. And once you understand the way a company values you, every conversation after that begins to feel different. I didn't head back to my desk right away. I walked down the hallway slowly, past the rows of glass-walled offices, past the bullpen where the junior reps were on calls, past the corner office that had been promised to me in soft language more than once over the years. I just stood for a moment near the windows facing east. Quiet. Still. And for the first time in a long time, I stopped thinking about what I needed to do to convince them. I started thinking about what they hadn't yet calculated they would lose. By the time I returned to my desk, the floor looked exactly the way it had when I left it 40 minutes earlier. Same headsets, same low hum of phone calls, same blinking cursors on the CRM dashboards. From the outside, my job looked clear. Sales, numbers, quotas, renewals, but that was only the surface of it. Underneath, what I actually did was hold relationships together. Some of those relationships were older than half the team on this floor. I knew which clients needed to be called the week before their renewal date, not the week of. I knew which procurement directors preferred a phone call over an email, which ones responded only after 6 p.m., which ones wanted the small talk first and the proposal second. None of that was written anywhere. None of it lived inside the CRM. It lived in my head in 11 years of memory in the rhythm of how I worked. I sat down and opened my pipeline. Everything green. Numbers ahead of target for the quarter. Renewals secured through the end of the fiscal year. 2 large expansions in late-stage negotiation. From a metrics standpoint, I was the cleanest profile in the division. That had been the case for years. And yet the leadership track was somehow still aligned somewhere out of reach. My phone buzzed at 11:14. A client. One of the larger accounts, not the biggest but close. I answered on the second ring. Catherine here. Relief in her voice came immediately. Catherine, thank God, we're having issues with the renewal terms. Procurement is pushing back hard. Send me the latest version, I said. I'll handle it. No meeting, no internal escalation, no looping in account management or legal or finance, just me. That was how it usually went. I pulled the document, traced the friction point, drafted a counterproposal, and sent it back to her within 20 minutes. By 11:47, the deal was stabilized. No internal record, no visibility, just another fire that never actually became a fire. That was the pattern, day after day, year after year. Quiet saves nobody saw, quiet fixes that never made it into the quarterly business review slides. And above me in the conference rooms with the better lighting, Mark would present the division's numbers to senior leadership. He was good at those rooms. Smooth, confident, a master of the executive summary. I had seen those decks. Sometimes I recognized my accounts on the bright blue bars of his charts, my closes contributing to a quarterly success story that bore no mention of my name. Just the team, just the division, just the brand. Around 2 in the afternoon, I walked past the large conference room near the executive suite. Mark was inside mid-presentation. Senior leadership seated around the table. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. I already knew the structure of what he was saying. Growth. Momentum. Strong pipeline, all technically true, all strategically incomplete, because none of it explained how the relationships had been built, who had built them, or what would happen if those relationships started to drift. That part doesn't translate well into slides, and over the years I had stopped trying to make it translate. It wasn't resentment, it was clarity. I understood what I did. I understood what the accounts needed. And I understood what would happen if that understanding ever walked out of the building. Not immediately, not dramatically, but eventually. Because sales relationships are like systems. They don't collapse all at once. They erode in small, almost invisible ways until one quarter the numbers don't add up and nobody can name a single reason why. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the screens again. Still green, still ahead of target. I had spent 11 years building that kind of consistency, learning the rhythm of each account, knowing which executives were 3 months away from changing jobs, knowing which procurement cycles ran long and which ones snapped shut at quarter end, knowing how to read a client's tone in an email and tell whether a renewal was secure or already slipping. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from any sales training. It comes from time, from being there. from listening more than speaking, from sitting across a table during dinners and conferences and trade shows and remembering the names of someone's children 3 years later. That was my value, not the title, not the salary band, the relationships and the trust that came with them. Clients didn't ask to be assigned to the company. They asked for me, not because I was unusually talented, because I was steady, present, and reliable. That matters more than most leaders realize, especially in industries where contracts are large and switching costs feel manageable. By the time the day ended, the dashboards were still clean. No emergencies, no escalations, just another stable Tuesday. That's what they saw. What they didn't see was how much quiet effort had gone into keeping it that way, or how quickly that stability could disappear if the wrong things were ignored long enough. I powered down my monitor slowly that evening. For years, I had taken pride in being the steady one, the one who could be counted on, the one who never made a fuss in meetings. But that day, after that conversation in the corner office, something about my own steadiness felt different. Not broken, just exposed. Like I had been looking at my role through the same lens they used to look at me. Replaceable, manageable, aligned. And for the first time, instead of trying to prove that lens wrong, I started wondering what would happen if I simply stopped polishing it for them. The first time they told me to wait, it sounded reasonable. That was 4 years before the meeting in the corner office. The company had just rolled out a new compensation framework that year, and everyone was being slotted into refreshed bands. Sales leadership was being restructured. 2 regional directors had left in the same quarter, and the executive team was still figuring out who would step into what role. So when I sat down with my director at the time, a woman named Helen, and asked about a promotion path into leadership, she didn't say no. She said, "Not this cycle, Catherine. The structure is still settling. There's a difference between not this cycle and not happening. At least there was supposed to be. Let's revisit at the next review," Helen had said. You're absolutely on the radar, and I believed her, because at that point I still trusted that the system worked the way it was supposed to. You hit your numbers, you take on more accounts, you mentor the new hires, you get promoted. Simple, predictable, so I waited. And while I waited, I kept doing what I had always done. I kept the largest accounts steady. I traveled to client offices when other reps wouldn't. I sat in on calls outside my territory when newer reps needed a senior voice in the room. I trained 2 new hires that year. One of them was named Olivia, 28 years old, recent transfer from a competitor, polished, articulate, easy to like. Mark, who at that time was a regional director just one level above Helen, took an interest in her immediately, invited her into pipeline reviews, put her on visible accounts, gave her airtime in front of leadership. I trained her on everything I had spent a decade learning: how to read a client's body language during a renewal pitch, how to recognize when procurement was bluffing, how to structure a discount that protected long-term margin instead of just closing a deal. She listened. She took notes. She asked sharp, intelligent questions. For a while, I thought it was good. The more people who understood the craft, the stronger the team would be. That's what I told myself. 8 months later, we had the next review cycle. I went in prepared. Pipeline numbers, retention rates, expansion deals, client testimonials, the names of executives at 3 different accounts who had personally requested I stay on their relationship. Helen listened, nodded, agreed with most of it. Then she said, "You've done outstanding work, Catherine, but compensation increases this cycle are being held flat across the senior IC band. We're trying to keep things consistent." Consistent. There was that word for the first time. Soft, reasonable, designed to sound fair. "Let's look at this again in the spring," she added. And just like that, the conversation moved forward another 6 months. No anger, not yet, just a quiet shift in expectation. But I kept going because by that point I was already too invested to stop. A year later, the landscape looked different. The company had grown. New product lines had launched. Bigger contracts were being signed. More complexity, more pressure, more late nights. Helen had moved sideways into a different division, and Mark had stepped into her role. He brought his own energy with him. More polished, more political, more attuned to how the executive floor talked about people. Olivia was now leading her own pod, presenting in monthly reviews, standing in front of leadership with confident slides and a steady voice. Sometimes I sat in those meetings. Sometimes I didn't. But either way, I knew where the numbers had originated. I had built half the pipeline she was now presenting. I had introduced her to 3 of the accounts she was now claiming as her own. I had stabilized 2 contracts she was now reporting as her wins, and I would watch her present them as if the relationships had always been hers. That's when I started noticing something. Not just what was being said in those rooms, but what wasn't. No mention of the 11-year client relationships that had been handed over during transitions. No mention of which deals had originally been seeded years before by someone whose name was no longer attached to the file. No mention of the conversations I had with executives at private dinners that turned into renewals 2 quarters later. Because those things don't fit neatly into a pipeline report. They don't translate into a chart. They sound like sentiment instead of strategy, and leadership doesn't reward sentiment. Leadership rewards visibility, even if that visibility is built on top of something invisible that someone else has been holding steady for years. The second time I asked about a promotion, I was more direct. Different room, different season, same script. This year we're focused on aligning leadership titles with formal management responsibility, HR said. We want to make sure career progression feels structured. Structured, another word, another way of saying not yet. Mark added that he was looking at expanding the leadership bench and there could be future opportunities. Future opportunities could be all words that sounded like motion without producing any. I walked out of that meeting the same way I walked out of the last one, composed, professional, still carrying the same accounts, still hitting the same numbers. Still expected to mentor whichever new hire landed in my pod the following Monday. And somewhere in the middle of that year, something shifted. Not outside, inside. I stopped expecting the next conversation to be different. That's when you start seeing things more clearly, not emotionally, logically. You notice who gets airtime in meetings and who gets relied on quietly behind the scenes. You notice whose name appears in the company newsletter and whose name appears only in the CRM activity logs. You notice who gets pulled into off-sites with the executive team and who gets pulled into emergency calls at 9 at night to save a renewal nobody else can save. I realized I wasn't being overlooked. I was being positioned, right where they wanted me. Stable, productive, predictable. That was what made me valuable, and that was exactly what was keeping me in place. By the 3rd year, the conversation barely registered as a surprise anymore. The room changed. The HR partner changed. The phrasing changed. The outcome didn't. By the 4th year, I walked into that corner office on the 22nd floor already knowing what was about to be said. And sitting there, hearing the words promotion isn't aligned again, I finally understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. They weren't waiting to say yes. They had decided no a long time ago. The only person still waiting was me. After the meeting that morning, I went back to my desk and didn't open anything for a while. I just sat there, same chair, same headset, same dashboards humming softly in the background. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about the next call I needed to make. I was thinking about how many fires I had quietly put out over the years, and how few of them had ever made it into a single performance review. That's a different kind of thought. It doesn't come with anger, it comes with distance. I leaned back and looked at my pipeline, everything green, everything tracking, that word again, aligned. But now it felt hollow because I knew what it took to keep it that way, and more importantly, I knew what would happen if I didn't. Not failure, not immediately, just exposure. Because relationships don't collapse overnight. They drift. And the only reason mine hadn't drifted in 11 years was that I never let them. I caught small signals early. A client's tone shifting on a Tuesday morning. A procurement director going quiet for 2 weeks longer than usual. A renewal date that looked fine on paper but felt different in person. I corrected those signals quietly before anyone noticed a pattern. Not because it was written into my job description, because I cared about the outcome. That day, something changed. I didn't decide to stop working. I decided to stop covering. There's a difference. I opened a thread from earlier that morning. One of my mid-tier accounts had flagged a billing inconsistency, small thing, the kind of issue I would normally trace, isolate, and resolve within an hour before it ever reached the client's procurement team. This time I read the email, then I closed it, not ignored, just left alone. Let the standard support process handle it. Let it move through the normal channels at the normal pace. 3 hours later, a follow-up came in. The client was now asking why the response was slow. The issue had reached their finance director. I responded politely, professionally, and gave the standard timeline that any account executive would give. I didn't pull strings. I didn't escalate to a director I happened to know personally. I didn't text the client's COO on his personal number to smooth things over. I let the system run the way the company had designed it to run. For years, I had been removing friction before anyone felt it. That day, I let them feel it first, not as punishment, as reality. I started doing that more often. Small things at first. Letting renewal reminders go out on the standard schedule instead of personally calling the client 2 weeks early. Letting routine account questions get routed through customer success instead of answering them myself from my phone at 10 at night. Following exactly what was expected of a senior account executive. Nothing more. Nothing hidden. At the same time, I started documenting everything. Account histories I had kept in my head for years. Decision makers I had built relationships with across multiple companies as those executives moved jobs. Notes on which clients responded to which approach, which procurement teams negotiated in good faith, and which ones played games. I wrote it all down, clear, detailed, accurate, not because I was planning to leave, because for the first time in 11 years I wasn't assuming I'd always be there. That shift changes how you work. You stop building yourself into the system. You start separating yourself from it. Mark stopped by my desk later that week. "Everything on track?" he asked, the same casual question he always asked when he was walking the floor for visibility. "Numbers are clean," I said. He nodded. "That's what we like to hear." Of course it was. As long as the numbers looked clean, nothing else mattered. He didn't ask what it took to keep them clean. He didn't ask which accounts had been wobbling that month or which clients had quietly raised concerns I had diffused before they reached his inbox. He didn't need to. From his perspective, the system worked. That was enough. I watched him walk back toward his office and realized something simple. He didn't understand the relationships. He understood the result. And as long as the result kept arriving on schedule, he assumed the relationships were a given. That assumption had protected him for years because I had made it true. That evening, I shut my laptop a little earlier than usual. Not dramatically early, just on time. I packed my bag, stood up, and took one last look at my screen before the autolock kicked in. Still green, still steady, but now I could see the small fractures starting to form beneath the surface. The ones I used to seal up before anyone noticed they were forming at all. I didn't feel guilty about it. I didn't feel angry. I just felt clear. I had spent more than a decade protecting something that didn't recognize the protection. And for the first time, I was okay letting it stand on its own. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. I was between meetings, mentally drafting a response to a renewal proposal that had stalled the week before, but something made me pick up. "Catherine Hale," I answered. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a voice that took me a second to place. "Catherine, it's Daniel Reyes from Northbridge Group." I leaned back in my chair. I hadn't spoken to Daniel in close to 2 years. Northbridge was a client I had worked with for nearly 7 years before they restructured and moved their account in-house. We had stayed in casual touch through industry events, but nothing recent. "I remember," I said. "Good to hear from you." He gave a small, warm laugh. "I figured you would." We talked for a few minutes the way old colleagues do. He asked how things were going at the company. I gave a measured answer. Steady. "Busy quarter." Then his tone shifted. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said. "We're building out a new commercial leadership team. We're growing into a new vertical, and your name has come up more than once." I didn't say anything immediately, not because I was surprised, because I wasn't. "When we worked with you," he continued, "you were the one who actually understood the relationship side of the business. You didn't just close deals. You held them together, held them together." Simple words, but they landed differently than anything I had heard inside that corner office a few weeks earlier. "We'd like to bring you in," he said, "Vice President of Strategic Accounts. Full ownership over a portfolio you'd help design. And the compensation reflects the level of responsibility." He gave me a number. I kept my expression neutral, but I felt it land. It wasn't just higher. It wasn't 15% above where I was. It wasn't even 30. It was the kind of number that doesn't need explanation. No alignment conversation, no structural justification, no revisit next cycle, just value stated plainly. "I'll need a few days," I said. "Take them," he replied, "but we're moving on this in the next 2 weeks." We ended the call. I sat there for a long moment. Same desk, same headset, same pipeline humming away on the screen in front of me. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about how to save a deal. I was thinking about leaving, not emotionally, logically, because when something on the outside finally confirms what you've known on the inside, it stops being a decision. It becomes timing. I gave my notice the following Monday, 2 weeks, standard, professional. Mark read the email on his phone and walked over to my desk within 10 minutes. "You're serious?" he asked. "Yes." He sat down on the edge of the workstation across from mine, which he never did. "Where are you going?" "I'll share details in due time," I said. He nodded slowly. "Catherine, is there anything we can do to change your mind?" I almost laughed at that. 4 years of conversations had answered that question already. Every alignment discussion, every structure reference, every next cycle. The time to ask that question had been 3 years ago. Maybe 2. Definitely not today. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, "but I've made my decision." He didn't push beyond that. He didn't ask for a counteroffer conversation. He didn't suggest escalating to his boss or to HR. He just nodded, told me he respected the decision, and said he'd make sure the transition was smooth. Smooth, that word again. No urgency, no real reflection, just process. HR scheduled an exit meeting later that afternoon. Same tone as every other meeting in that building. Calm, efficient. "Thank you for your contributions, Catherine," Diane said, sliding a single page across the table. "We'll work with you to make the handover clean." Clean. I almost smiled at the word, because nothing about what I had built over 11 years was clean. It was layered, it was textured. It was built on hundreds of small understandings between me and the people on the other end of the phone. But to them, it was a portfolio to be reassigned. Just a list of account names and contract values and renewal dates. I spent the next 2 weeks doing exactly what was expected. Nothing more. Nothing less. I prepared detailed handover documents for every account. Contact information, renewal timelines, contract specifics, historical context where it was strictly relevant. If someone followed those documents carefully, the accounts would function for a while. But there were things you couldn't write down. The unspoken rhythm with a procurement lead who only responded to direct phone calls. The shorthand you developed with a CFO who had been through 2 of your renewals already. The instinct that told you a client was going to push for a discount before they even mentioned it. That part stayed with me. Not deliberately. It just wasn't something that could transfer in a handover document. Olivia sat with me a few times during those 2 weeks. She had been assigned 3 of my largest accounts. She took notes, asked sharp questions, walked through pipeline strategy with me the same way she had 4 years earlier when she first joined. But something about it felt different now. She was trying to absorb in days what had taken me 11 years to build, and she didn't have 11 years. She had me sitting across from her for a couple of hours at a stretch. I answered everything she asked, honestly, clearly, nothing held back, but I didn't volunteer anything beyond the question. I didn't fill in the gaps she didn't yet know existed. That wasn't my role anymore. On my last day, there was no large send-off, a small lunch with a few teammates, a short email from HR thanking me for my service and wishing me success in my future endeavors. That was it. 11 years reduced to a single sentence in a corporate template. I packed my desk the way I had packed every other evening for the last 11 years. Unhurried, unsentimental. Nobody stopped me on the way out. There was no last-minute counteroffer, no senior executive appearing in the doorway to ask if there was anything they could do, just normal. I walked past the conference rooms where I had sat through hundreds of meetings, past the corner office where I had been told 4 times that the timing wasn't right, past the bullpen where the junior reps were still on their afternoon calls. As I reached the elevator, I paused for a moment, not to look back, just to register that this was the last time. Then I stepped in. The doors closed, and just like that I was gone. The first message came 8 days after I left, not from leadership, from an internal account manager I had worked with for years. "Hey, are you reachable for a quick question?" I looked at the message for a moment before responding. "What's going on?" She replied a minute later. "Northbridge Holdings is asking why their renewal terms changed." I read the message twice. The renewal terms hadn't changed. Not really. The standard renewal package had been sent to them on the standard schedule, exactly the way the company's processes were designed to work. But Northbridge wasn't a standard account. Northbridge had a custom understanding with us that had been negotiated quietly, in person, over the course of 2 dinners and 1 phone call I had personally handled 3 years earlier. None of that lived in the CRM. None of it was in the handover documents either, because none of it was technically policy. It was relationship. I gave her a brief professional answer, suggested she review the previous year's contract carefully and reach out to the client's procurement contact directly. That was it. No deep dive. No stepping in to draft a custom proposal at midnight, just distance. Over the next several days, more messages arrived. Nothing official, just quiet inquiries, questions, small concerns. The kinds of things that used to come straight to my phone before they ever reached a manager's inbox. Now they were moving through the system, slower, less certain. Olivia was trying to handle them through structure, formal account reviews, status meetings, written briefings to senior leadership. From what I heard, she was managing it well on paper, tracking issues, documenting next steps, following the playbook. But the playbook wasn't built for what those accounts actually needed. Those accounts needed memory, instinct, the kind of judgment that comes only from years of being inside a relationship. That difference doesn't show up in the first week. It builds. A small delay becomes two delays become a pattern, patterns become questions, and questions in sales become hesitation. By the end of the second week, hesitation had reached the clients. Nothing dramatic at first. Slight pauses in renewal conversations. Requests for additional approvals from procurement. A few executives quietly putting feelers out for competitive quotes, just to compare, just to understand the market. The kind of soft signal that almost never makes it into a leadership dashboard until it's already too late. I heard about 1 phone call in particular. A longtime client, one of my largest, asking the new account team directly, "Is something different on your side lately?" That question matters more than any internal report, because once a client feels a difference, the relationship has already changed. And once they start watching, they start comparing. I stayed quiet, focused on my new role at Northbridge Group, new systems, new portfolio, new team. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding something together behind the scenes. It felt lighter, not easier, just clearer. But even from a distance, I could see the shape of what was happening at my old company, not because I was involved, because I had watched the same pattern play out at other companies over the years, just never all at once. From their perspective, nothing had failed. No client had formally terminated. No major contract had been pulled. Just small inconsistencies, slight slippage. And slippage is easy to ignore until it isn't. By the start of the third week, the tone of the messages I was receiving had changed. They were sharper, shorter, more urgent. What changed? That phrase appeared more than once. Not just from inside the company, from clients themselves. That's when I knew it had moved past small issues, because clients don't ask that question casually. The first real sign came from Northbridge Holdings. Not the new company I had joined, but the old client account I had supported for years. They reduced their committed annual volume, quietly. No press release, no formal escalation, just a smaller number on the renewal paperwork, 12% the first week. Then more. That's how clients react when they're uncertain. They don't leave, they pull back, they test, they watch. And if things don't improve, they move. I heard about it through a former colleague I still trusted. "They're asking for service guarantees now," she told me. Of course they were. because they used to have those guarantees without ever needing to ask for them. They just didn't know what made them real. Inside the company, leadership started noticing the numbers. The weekly sales reports weren't quite as clean. Renewal close rates were softening. Two large expansions that had been forecast as nearly closed had quietly slipped to the next quarter. Nothing dramatic on its own, but together enough to raise concern. Emergency meetings started, not the public ones. The closed-door ones, senior leadership only. Mark was in those now, trying to explain trends that didn't quite line up. Olivia was pulled in too, asked to walk through account histories that didn't yet make sense to her, because on paper everything was still operational. The CRM was active, pipelines were being worked, calls were being made, but the outcomes weren't matching the activity. That's the hardest situation to explain when nothing is technically broken, but nothing is producing the way it used to. I heard they started pulling reports, digging into account histories, looking for a clear cause. There wasn't one, because it wasn't one thing. It was a chain. Small judgment calls that used to happen automatically now missed. Conversations that used to occur informally now scheduled too late. Relationships that used to be maintained continuously now reduced to transactional touchpoints. That kind of gap doesn't show up as a failure, it shows up as drift. And drift is hard to measure until it becomes loss. By the middle of the third week after I left, a second large client had quietly opened a competitive review. By the end of that week, a third client had asked to renegotiate their renewal terms. The number came in by the close of the month, 35%. That's how much divisional sales had dropped across the strategic accounts I used to manage. Not total company revenue, just the part directly tied to the relationships I had built and maintained for over a decade. 35% in 1 month. That doesn't happen because of one resignation. It happens because of years of accumulated dependency finally becoming visible. The call came late on a Thursday evening. Unknown number, but I knew exactly where it was coming from. I let it ring twice before answering. Catherine. There was no introduction, just a familiar voice. Senior leadership, less polished now, more direct. We're seeing some softness in the strategic accounts. We'd value your perspective, of course they would. We'd like to bring you in as an advisor, short term. Compensation would not be an issue. I stood by the window of my new office. Different skyline, different floor, different feeling entirely. I appreciate the offer, I said calmly. But for 4 years you had every chance to recognize what I was doing. You chose not to. There was a long silence, no defense, no correction, just acknowledgement. I understand, he said quietly. And for the first time in any conversation I had ever had with senior leadership at that company, I believed that he did. I'm focused on my current role, I said. That was the truth, not an excuse. A decision. We ended the call shortly after. No tension, no bitterness, just closure. Because this was never about revenge. It was about reality, and reality had finally shown up. Not in a performance review, not in a corner office, in a number on a quarterly report. If this story resonated with you, please like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more. Your support means everything, and I'd love to hear what part of Catherine's story stayed with you.